So it was the last night that Jesus was with his disciples. They had gathered in a large upstairs room, and Jesus knew that this was going to be his last opportunity to talk to them about the most important things before he left. He'd been telling them for quite some time, a large percentage of his 3 years with them, he'd been telling them that he would be leaving, preparing them for the fact that he'd be arrested, he would be tortured, he'd be crucified, buried, but he would rise again. And he could tell it never sunk in. They never got it. In fact, they would fight with him about it. Tell him, that's not going to happen to you, Lord. So this was his last night with them, and he wanted to speak to them about the most important things. And the occasion was Passover. And Passover was something their ancestors had been celebrating for 1,400 years, where they remembered together as families what their ancestors had done. The last of the 10 plagues, the taking of the firstborn son throughout the land of Egypt. And each home that had faith and believed in the Lord was to take a lamb and to raise it, fatten it up, to kill it, because that's how you get meat. We don't know that anymore, but that's how it happens. To take some of the blood of the lamb and put it on the doorposts of their home in Egypt, and then to roast the lamb, to eat it together as a family, as a feast. It was a home-based, family-based way to remember the Lord. And some of the feasts, most of the feasts of Israel were not so family-centric. But Passover was to be done in a home with your family, your what we would call a nuclear family and your extended family, but you were to celebrate and eat it as a family. So here was Jesus, single. Several of his disciples were single. Several were married. And it's Passover. And whether they're single or married, they're supposed to be with their family in some way on Passover. But they're not. They're together with Jesus in an upper room. And he's explaining to them what he's been saying for quite some time, that they are his family, that they're to take this family experience and he's going to be saying spread it around the world, that everyone is welcome in this family, that you can become a brother or sister to each other, a brother, the book of Hebrews, or sister to Jesus himself, that God his Father can be God our Father, that we can be welcomed into the family around a table, and that he's the center of this feast. So it's his last chance to talk to them about the most important things, and he uses an image in the passage we're going to look at today to describe what this is all about. That's really interesting. When we think about the concept of eternity and spending eternity with God, what we sometimes call heaven, although when you read the book of Revelation at the end, heaven comes to earth. So it's a renewed earth that heaven exists in, and earth and heaven are reconciled in a way that we can't even imagine. But when we think about this idea of leaving this world and going to the next, and we often use the word heaven to describe that experience, it's interesting how Jesus describes what heaven is. How do you picture it with an idea, with a concept that would make sense to us, what heaven is? And so we've been doing this series called I Am. And today we're going to look at Jesus' claim that he is the way, the truth, and the life. He's just sat down at what would be a family table with his disciples. They're all away from their own families. They're with each other as a family. And at one of these feasts, if it was a wealthy enough home, there would be a servant that would come and wash everyone's feet. And his own family members, Jesus' own family members that he's been traveling with, creating this feeling of family for 3 years, they're all jostling to see who can be at the best seats at the table. And they're all sitting there with dirty feet, and no one is willing to serve. And Jesus takes up a towel and a basin of water and begins to wash his disciples' feet one by one, including Judas, who is going to leave during the dinner to betray him. And the last thing that Jesus does with Judas is wash his feet in love. But they've just had this experience of having their feet washed by their leader, by their master. And then Jesus describes to them what's going to be happening, that he's going to be leaving, and uses this image in John 14. Don't let your hearts be troubled. He's just told them he's leaving. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. There is more than enough room in my Father's home. So when Jesus describes what we think of as heaven, what he says is, it's our home. It's home. There's so many different ways you could imagine. What are all the ways that Jesus could have described what heaven would be like? So many different images, metaphors, similes, ways that you could to get human beings' minds to understand what this experience would be like. And Jesus chooses home. Home. Now, for some of us who grew up in homes that were filled with conflict, friction, divorce, people in and out of our lives, maybe even abuse, for us, home has a mixed feeling sometimes when we think about the homes that we grew up in or the homes that we're in now. They're always imperfect pictures of what Jesus is talking about when he talks about home. Always imperfect pictures. For some of us, far more imperfect than others. We, the last several days, have had a nephew visiting with his 2 kids from Oregon. And so I've gotten to watch, he's trying to save money, and we don't have a guest room in our house anymore because my mom lives in the guest room now. So he's like, can we stay with you? I'm like, well, you can camp on the couch, I guess. Like, we'll lay some stuff out in the living room. And he's like, yeah, I need to save some money on this trip, So he and his 2 children have been camping in the living room. So they're sleeping on the couch and this fold-out phone thing, and they are definitely guests. It is not their home. They are guests. And the very experience that they're having in our home is a guest experience. It's like you're on temporary things. We'll find some blankets to throw over you. Like, we'll figure out the food. One of them I found out when they came is can't have gluten. So I'm like, oh, okay, trip to the grocery store. Different foods we don't normally have in our house. Okay, so it's like you can love and serve your guests, but it's not the same as if it were their home. When you're staying in someone else's home, you know that feeling of being a guest. Like, I'm not normally here, so I should be really, as accommodating as I can, as grateful as I can, understand their ways of doing things, which aren't the same as my ways of doing things. I need to fit into them and their home. And that's not what Jesus is talking about. What he's talking about is your best human experience on earth of feeling like the place where you live is safe, secure, comfortable, known, loved, valued. He's talking about home. Home. And so often we connect to God and relate to God as if we're, unwanted guests. Like, I don't know. I know I'm kind of messing things up being in this family here because I'm so far from what I'm supposed to be. But, I don't want to be a bother. And Jesus is saying, no, I want you to know that being in a relationship with me and my Father is about being at home, being at ease, being comfortable, being loved, accepted, welcomed. So he uses that image, which when you think about all the things he could have chosen, it's important he chose that one. He says there's more than enough room in my Father's home. He does not say, I don't have a room for you, you can sleep on the couch. He doesn't say that. He says there's more than enough room. Like, it doesn't matter how many people want to come. There's more than enough room. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I will come and get you, so that you will always be with me where I am. So home is being with Jesus. It's being with his Father. And you know the way to where I'm going. I love Thomas. He and Peter, they say the things that other people are thinking. We don't know, Lord. We have no idea where you're going, so how can we know the way? Like, he's thinking geography. He's thinking navigation. And Jesus is talking about, I'm going someplace. I'm going to the Father's house, and I'm preparing a place for you, and you know how to get there. Tom's like, we don't know how to get there. And we don't have the GPS. We don't know how to get there. How do we get there? What are you talking about? And Jesus told him, I am. And as we've seen through the whole series, a reference back to Exodus 3, Yahweh, the one who always is, the one who will be, the one who has been, the ever-present one, Yahweh. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. If you had really known me, you would know who my Father is. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied. And Jesus replied, have I been with you all this time, Philip, and yet you still don't know who I am? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So why are you asking me to show him to you? Don't you believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words I speak are not my own, but my Father who lives in me does his work through me. Just believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. Or at least believe because of the work you have seen me do. So when you think about the word heaven, what comes to mind for you? I wonder if it really is home. Home, if that's the first thing that comes to mind for you. That's what Jesus wants to be the first thing that comes to mind. So when Jesus chose to describe heaven using a metaphor, he chose the image of being at home, in a home, with him and our Heavenly Father. So the Father's home is our home. Now, if some of you have read in the King James Version, and then maybe you've sung hymns based on John 14:2. And so in the King James Version it says, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. So then there's hymns talking about these mansions we're going to be living in the future. And so some of us, if we live in apartments or mobile homes or small houses now, we're like, but one day I'm going to have a mansion. And it's important to understand there's a lot of reasons why the King James Version isn't probably the best version for us to be using now, one of which is it's over 400 years old and English has changed. So a mansion used to mean in the King James era, it's translating the bishop, reusing a term from the Bishop's Bible before it and Tyndale's Bible before that. Mansion used to be a place where you lived. And it could be a room, it could be a little house. It did not mean something glamorous and big. But over time in English, over the last 400 years, when you say someone lives in a mansion, you mean a big house. So the church we were serving in until a couple years ago in Salinas, I wasn't there at the time this happened, but we were looking for property. And so what came onto the market was a developer had built a 5,000 square foot house for him, his wife, and I think 1 or 2 children in this 5,000 square foot house. And it had this house, 12 and a half acres, and a big barn where he collected his 56 Chevys. And so we bought this property with this gigantic house. It looks exactly like Graceland, like these giant columns, like this southern mansion. And you're like, is that really the vibe we're trying to go for in our church? So the pastor, who I later went to join as the executive pastor later. I became the lead pastor there. But when I got there, I came to be the executive pastor for a pastor I'd work for when I was in college. And if you wanted to get under his skin, the fastest way to do it was to say, yeah, this new person came to the church and they wanted to know if the pastor lives in the mansion. Because that is like the antithesis of what he wanted anyone to ever think, that he would live in a mansion. So if you wanted to get under his skin, you'd just say that. That would be a teasing thing to do, like, oh, go over to the mansion in room whatever and get this. He would just be like, ah, little inside joke that the staff would have. But we did. I worked in one of the, sometimes felt like I worked in one of the offices that used to be a bedroom. So all the bedrooms became offices, and some of the common rooms became meeting rooms. So we all had like parts of this house. We lived in this giant house. And then we later built like classrooms and all kinds of other things. But if it comes to your mind that somehow you're going to be living in a mansion, and sometimes we joke about how, like, the closer you get to God in this life, the bigger your house is going to be in the next one. That's like the complete opposite of what Jesus is talking about. So what Jesus is talking about is the Father has what maybe we would call a mansion. He has a room that can expand infinitely to everyone having room and a place to feel at home there. This, by the way, is the house that is used to film Downton Abbey, if you're a fan of that show. My wife and I have enjoyed that quite a bit. So that is not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about the Father's house, and we're going to look at what houses look like in the first century in a minute. But he's talking about the Father's house and that it can be added onto, and there's rooms. Everyone can have as much room as they want and feel at home in the Father's house. So here's a little question. What was Jesus' hometown during his years of ministry? Was it Bethlehem, Capernaum, or Nazareth? Nazareth? No, it was Capernaum. So he was born in Bethlehem. He had to flee to Egypt, came back. Actually, he lived in Bethlehem for a couple years. He went from like just a little stable to a rented home, apparently, because it's a different word that's used later. And then he had to flee Herod, so they went to Egypt when he was a baby. They came back. They ended up settling in Nazareth. So that's where he grew up, in Nazareth. But when he started his ministry, his hometown was Capernaum. It's a little closer. It's a little seaside fishing village. It's still a little seaside fishing village right on the Sea of Galilee, or Lake Kinneret, they call it now. But that became his home base. That's where at least 4 of his disciples came from, a little fishing village right on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. Nazareth's a little bit inland. So that was his home base, mainly Peter's home that he grew up in, that he owned. That's where Jesus' home base was. So if you go today, if you ever get a chance to go to Israel and you go to Capernaum, this is the sign that greets you when you arrive there. It says, this is like their town sign. Next slide. So it says, Capernaum, the town of Jesus. And it actually comes from a couple of words, Kfar Nahum. So you know the prophet you may have heard of in the Old Testament, one of the little prophets at the end. They call them minor prophets, not because they're not important, but because they're shorter books. Nahum is one of those prophets. So Kfar Nahum, the village of Nahum. And Nahum means comfort. So Kfar Nahum, Capernaum, we often say now, the village of comfort. And interestingly, when archaeologists started excavating in the village that was this place where Jesus spent his ministry years, this is some pictures of the excavations they've done of the town. So there are these stone walls that separate. The houses are connected to each other through, and then there's different rooms. But this is what, when Jesus was telling, I'm going to, be with my Father, and he's making a room for you, in their mind, they would be thinking, okay, so we have a house, and every time the next generation comes in, we add on to it with another little stone room, and then there's a place for them to be as well, like we're in the same house. One of the interesting things that came as they began to excavate here is they found one particular room underneath a later church that had been built. And when they went underneath the church, they saw that underneath that was a first century like house, smaller house that was underneath there. And then they started excavating that and finding out that it was plastered over, but before it was plastered over, it's just a regular house. And sometime in the first century, they plastered over it and they started making it fancier, and there were like graffiti on it, like Christian graffiti. And it would say things like, "Christ have mercy," people would write. They would write like little Christian graffiti on the walls of this house. And so what archaeologists came to believe is, why would this house in the first century all of a sudden be turned into a church, and all of a sudden be turned into a bigger church, and then later a much bigger church? Why would all that happen? Why would there be Christian graffiti on it? And the best hypothesis is that this is literally the house of Peter. So when you go to Capernaum, it's not without reason that they say this is the house of Peter. This is where Peter actually literally lived, where Jesus was his home base of ministry. This was his house. And after Christ died and resurrected, this became a sacred space where Jesus had lived, and they started to worship there. And then they said, let's move ourselves out of the house. Let's make it a meeting room, and then let's make it a bigger church and a bigger church. And later it became this really large church. So if you go there today, you can see the house where it's a very good chance that Peter lived, that Jesus lived in this home during his ministry years. And it's all covered over now with glass to protect it, so there's several pictures there. And you can see underneath this glass enclosure the original walls of that of Peter's home that was turned into a church probably. So, going backwards in order about what Jesus said about himself. He said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." He's the life. So Jesus is the way that we have reality, vitality, the experience of things feeling alive that we should be encountering. Jesus says, "I'm the way to have life. I'm the opposite of death. I'm going to conquer death. I am life. Wherever I am, I bring life." So when he touched a dead body would come back to life. When he touched a leper, leprosy would go away and life would come back. When he touched someone that was a social outcast, that the culture had said, "Get out of here, we don't want you around," when he touched that person, they were welcomed into life. That everything about Jesus, wherever he went, he brought life. So what was in the law was that you were not allowed, if you were like a priest, to touch a dead body or it would defile you. So God was teaching people that death and life are different. And we ought to seek life and avoid death. But one of the ways he taught them was if you accidentally touched a dead body, if you accidentally walked on top of a tomb that a body was buried in, it defiled you. Like death conquered you. He was teaching people that death was bad. So every time Jesus touched someone who society said would defile him, he made them alive. He conquered the disease. He conquered the death. He brought life where other people were defiled. He brought victory over that, over illness, over death, over all things. He brings life wherever he goes. So Jesus, the I am, is the life. He's also the truth. He doesn't just say true things. He is the truth. The reality, the founding of everything that is real is found in Jesus. He is the truth. We can count on him. When he says things, we can believe him. His description of reality is true. His description of who God is true. We can encounter the Father through him. He represents the truth. And he's also the way. The way. And he said to be at home is to be in the Father's home. So let me read that part again. "Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. There is more than enough room in my Father's home. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I will come and get you, so that you will always be with me where I am. And you know the way to where I am going." "No, we don't, Lord," Thomas said. "We have no idea where you're going, so how can we know the way?" Jesus told him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me." So when we think about our future, heaven is a place where a room is being prepared for us in a large family home. And it will be specially tailored to us to be everything that we need to experience that feeling of being loved and welcomed and taken care of and thought about, of being at home. At home. He is the way. He is the way to know the Father. So he says this to his disciples: if you had really known me, you would know who my Father is. So Jesus makes this incredible claim that to these people he spent 3 years with, if you look at me and understand who I am, you know exactly who God is. Exactly. I am the perfect representation of who God is. I bear the image of God in perfection, not imperfectly like human beings. We're made in the image of God, but our mirror has gotten dulled and scratched where we don't perfectly picture God like we were intended to. But Jesus says, when you see my reflection, you see the Father perfectly as he actually is. So look at me and you'll know who God is. How God feels about people who sin, how God feels about people who are ill, how God feels about people who are struggling, how God feels about people who are rejected, how God feels about people who think they're better than other people and use their religion as a power tool over them. Just look at how I have been as I've gone through my ministry, and you know exactly who God is. So Jesus replied, have I been with you all this time, Philip, and yet still you don't know who I am? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So why are you asking me to show him to you? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? So a little later in this, we're going to get into it a little bit in our next IAMs, but a little later he introduces the Holy Spirit and says, I'm going to leave you, but I am going to send the Holy Spirit to dwell inside of you. And there is an eternal love relationship with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. We love each other. We serve each other. We honor each other. We are one, and yet we are three. And in this mystery, I want you to know you're being welcomed into a community of love that the Father, Son, and Spirit have known for all eternity. And you're being invited in to make this your home with us. The Father's in me, I'm in the Father. He'll say, we are with you, you're in us. Like you're invited in, deeply into the middle of a loving community, a home, a home. Don't you believe that I'm in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I speak are not my own, and my Father who lives in me does his work through me. Just believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe because of the work you have seen me do. So whenever you see in the Bible an image of God that isn't something that you see in Jesus, he would say you're misunderstanding who God is. Because if you look at me, you can see exactly who God is. And there's sometimes people use this, well, like in the Old Testament, God seems super mean and kind of like vindictive and super like crazy. And then I like Jesus. He's better than the God of the Old Testament. And if we ever think thoughts like that, Jesus saying you're misunderstanding who God is altogether then. Let me take you back to the Old Testament and explain to you who God is, because the God of the Old Testament is who I'm perfectly representing and showing to you. So when we get that idea that somehow the God of the Old Testament's a different kind of God than Jesus is, we're misunderstanding who God is. Jesus says, I perfectly picture him. And so we need to use him as a filter through which we then read some of the stories that are seem very odd in the Old Testament. If we've seen Jesus in the scriptures, we've seen the Father. He perfectly shows us who God the Father is. Perfectly. And who he shows us is always an invitation to come home. So one of the things that we need to do is, like, all of life is spiritual growth. When we grow in one area, we're growing spiritually as well. So one of the things that we need to grow in as human beings is like to untangle ourselves from the imperfect experiences of love we've had with other human beings. So to the degree that the home we grew up in was always an imperfect, but sometimes incredibly imperfect picture of what home's supposed to feel like, what a father's supposed to be like, what a father-son relationship or child relationship is supposed to be like, that to the degree that the home we grew up in doesn't picture that, when we work on the things that happen to us in the homes that we grew up in and experience healing there, we actually can experience more of God in our lives, because we're not saying like, oh, I don't want that. You say it's home. I don't know. That doesn't feel safe. So the more we understand how to process some of the pain we've been through in the homes we grew up in marriages that broke, in the trauma we've been through, in the betrayals we've experienced, the more we process those things, the better able we are to feel like it's a good thing that we're brought home. We're brought home. So that's spiritual growth. Therapy can be spiritual growth. NA program can be spiritual growth. AA program can be spiritual growth. Sharing in our family time about the things we're struggling with is spiritual growth. Because the more we share about what we're going through, the more able we are to receive the love that God has for us and the experience of home. Because our goal is to come home. It's to come home. And what a beautiful, beautiful picture. Now, we could all describe, and it would be a valuable thing in safe context to describe sort of the home you grew up in. We had another nephew, my brother's other son. He came to visit, several months ago, was staying with us. And he said this really interesting thing, or asked me this really interesting question. He said, growing up, I didn't really hear positive stories about you and my dad's dad. I didn't hear positive stories about him. Do you have any positive stories you could share with me about him? And I don't know, literally, I don't know what my brothers told his kids about our dad. And he had many, many faults and flaws. He was serially unfaithful. He was probably a sex addict, bisexual, so many affairs with men, just one-night stand kind of things, multiple with women as well. But so it's easy to look at someone's life and understand how your family got sideways because of those things. It's easy to look at that and say well, here's all the negative things I have about my dad. And again, I don't know what my brothers told him, but I said, I just spent about half an hour telling good stories about our dad to my nephew. And I go, has he ever told you about this? Has he ever told you about this? He said, no, literally never. I've never heard this story. And like all of us, we're imperfect reflections, right? We're glorious ruins. So my dad had many wonderful, wonderful qualities as well, as we all do. So, but when your experience of thinking about a human being is they're all this way or all that way, it keeps you from having that experience of home, that experience of home. So getting to describe to my nephew the home that I grew up in was actually a good thing for me to do and a good thing for him to hear. It was good to reflect on some of the good things his dad had experienced growing up, that at least I think he did, hearing stories about my dad. But for all of us, when we process those kinds of issues, it's good to understand that our negative ideas that we have in our brain that have to do with home are not the description of who God is. That those imperfect descriptions of marriages that failed and struggled, or parents who struggled, that those descriptions not define what home is. That we have a perfect father, a perfect parent. That we are called to be people who grow into being children of God and experience and receive his fatherhood. And that our goal is to be at home here on earth and in the future. So I'm going to just give you a chance to spend a moment with God